Number 5. Renee Sweeney. On January 27, 1998, 23-year-old university student Renee Sweeney was working the day shift at the adults-only video store in Sudbury, Ontario. At 11:27 a.m., a young, white man who was wearing glasses and had short blonde hair walked into the store. He pulled out a knife and started to stab Sweeney in front of the store's counter. He then went to the washroom, probably to wash off Sweeney's blood. He came back out and found that Sweeney had crawled behind the counter where there was a phone. Determined to kill her, the man walked behind the counter and continued to stab her. Just after 11:30, two of Sweeney's friends came into the store. The killer pushed past them and walked out the door. Sweeney's friends found her body and called 911. Sweeney had been stabbed over 30 times and she died as a result of her wounds. $200 was also taken from the register. When the police investigated the murder, they surmised that Sweeney may have been stalked before she was killed. In the days leading up to the murder, Sweeney had gotten a lot of phone calls that were hang-ups. Also, when she went to work, she used to park in the spot furthest from the store. However, in the days leading up to the murder, she parked as close to the store as she could. Her co-workers thought that this was very out of character for her. In one sense, the police were lucky because they were able to collect a lot of evidence from the murder scene. Besides the eyewitnesses who saw the killer and gave a description that resulted in this sketch, the killer also left behind fingerprints. Another set of clues was found a short distance away from the store. As he fled the scene, the killer discarded the jacket and a pair of white gardening gloves that he wore during the murder. The jacket is rather unique. It is a High Sierra windbreaker and it was only sold by Mervyn's department stores in California between 1994 and 1995. In the left breast pocket of the jacket, there was a diaper pin. Finally, the police had the killer's DNA, which was taken from tissue that was found under Sweeney's fingernails. From the DNA, the police were able to develop this snapshot of the killer. This is what the killer would have looked like in 1998 when he was about 25 years old. One thing that the police noticed was how similar the sketch composed from the DNA profile looks compared to the sketch that was based on the eyewitnesses' descriptions. Despite all the evidence that they have, the police have not named a suspect, and the case is currently cold. Number 4. Cynthia Anderson. Starting in summer 1981, 20-year-old Cynthia Anderson started to get unsettling phone calls at her workplace, which was a law office in Toledo, Ohio. Anderson was so worried about the calls that her employers had an emergency buzzer installed at her desk. She also kept the doors to the office locked at all times. Anderson was also apparently plagued by horrible nightmares where she was being attacked by a mysterious man. On the morning of August 4th, 1981, Anderson was working alone in the office. Witnesses last saw Anderson around 9:45 a.m., but when people called the office at 10 a.m., there was no answer. When the lawyers arrived in the office after being in court in the morning, they found that the office was ready for the day, but Anderson was gone. Her car was in the parking lot, but her purse and keys were gone. She also didn't leave a note saying where she went, which is something she always did. Finally, there was a book open on her desk. It was open to a page where the main character is being violently kidnapped. The police do not think that Anderson chose to disappear. She had no personal problems and she was looking forward to attending Bible college in the fall. Also, she left behind a large amount of money in her bank account and her social security number has not been used since she went missing. There are several suspects in the case, including a set of serial killer brothers named Anthony and Nathaniel Cook. They were convicted of murdering 9 people in Ohio, but they have denied killing Anderson. Another theory is that a drug dealer and his attorney are responsible for her disappearance. The attorney worked at the same law firm where Anderson worked in 1981, and the theory is that Anderson overheard something that she shouldn't have heard. However, there is not much evidence to back up either theory, and no one has ever been charged in connection with Anderson's disappearance. Sadly, her body has never been found. Number 3. Mary Shotwell Little. In October 1965, 25-year-old Mary Shotwell Little was working at the CNS Bank in Atlanta, Georgia. On October 14th, she left work for the day and went and picked up some groceries for a party that she planned to throw the next day. Her husband of 6 weeks, Roy Little, had been away on a business trip, and she wanted to throw him a welcome home party. After getting the groceries, she put them in her car, and then she met a co-worker for dinner at a restaurant in the Lenox Square Shopping Center. At about 8 p.m., Mary and her co-worker parted ways. The next morning, Mary didn't show up for work and she didn't call in. Mary's boss asked the co-worker who dined with her the night before if she knew Mary's whereabouts. After calling her at home and not getting an answer, they decided to phone the mall to see if Mary's car, a 1965 Mercury Comet, was still in the parking lot. The security guard checked and the car wasn't in the lot. A few hours later, Mary's boss decided to drive to the mall, and there, in plain sight, was Mary's car, parked in the exact spot that Mary had parked it the night before. The police were notified and they came to examine the car. There was a fine layer of red dust on the exterior of the car, as if it had been driven on a dirt road. Inside the car, they found the groceries that Mary had purchased in the back seat. On the console between the two seats were Mary's undergarments. They had recently been worn, and they were neatly folded. However, one stocking was missing. There was also a little bit of blood in the car, but no more than a common nosebleed. Finally, the Littles recorded their car usage in a mileage log. Using the log and the odometer, the police concluded that there were 41 miles unaccounted for. The first person of interest was Mary's husband Roy. Some of Mary's friends didn't like him, and supposedly he didn't seem to care that his wife was missing. He also refused to take a lie detector test multiple times. However, the police had no reason to suspect him. He had a solid alibi, there were no marital problems, and he had nothing to gain by killing his wife. Another suspect in the disappearance is a person who was stalking Mary before she went missing. In the weeks leading up to Mary's disappearance, she was getting strange phone calls at work. Mary told the unidentified caller that she was married and could no longer go over to the caller's house, but the caller could visit Mary at her house if he or she wanted to. Mary also received a bouquet of roses from someone who only identified themselves as a secret admirer. The police went to the flower shop, which wasn't far from Mary's house, but they couldn't identify the person who ordered the flowers. Finally, several of Mary's friends said that in the weeks before she went missing, she was afraid to be alone. She didn't like to be home alone, and she didn't like to drive alone. However, she never told anyone why she was afraid to be by herself. A month later, Mary still hadn't been found, but the police did uncover a strange clue. In the early morning hours on the day after Mary went missing, her credit card was used to buy gas at a 24-hour gas station in her hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina, which is about a 4-hour drive from Atlanta. 12 hours later, her credit card was used again to purchase gas. This time it was in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is about 2.5 hours away from Charlotte, heading away from Atlanta. The receipts were checked and both of them were signed by Mary, and it appears to be her handwriting. The police interviewed the gas station attendants at both stores. The employee in Charlotte said that he remembered the woman who signed for the gas because she had a cut on her forehead and she was trying to hide her face. She was with a man and it looked like he was giving her orders. The attendant at the Raleigh gas station said that the woman who signed the receipt had blood on her and she was with two men. Neither gas station attendant could remember what type of car she was traveling in, but there was a record of the license plate, but it turned out that the license plate was stolen off a car in Charlotte. Those were the last sightings of Mary, and her body has never been found. What the police believe happened was that Mary was grabbed by someone in the parking lot of the Lenox Shopping Center. The kidnapper drove Mary away in her car, and then they changed vehicles. Mary and her kidnapper then drove to Charlotte, where she was possibly held for 10 hours. While she was being held in Charlotte, an accomplice returned Mary's car to the parking lot in the Lenox Shopping Center, where she had parked the car the night before. Then the kidnapper and possibly his accomplice drove with Mary to Raleigh. An FBI agent who worked on the case thinks that Mary's body is buried somewhere north of Raleigh. If the theory is true, it only adds more questions instead of clearing anything up. For example, why would the kidnapper have the car returned in broad daylight to such a public place where the victim was last seen? Why would the kidnapper take Mary to her hometown where there is a better chance of her being recognized? Also, why did he make her pay for gas at the two gas stations instead of hiding her in the car? Why not pay in cash? Why start a paper trail by forcing your kidnapped victim to use her credit card? All these steps seem risky, and it would have only drawn more attention to the kidnapping. However, despite these odd steps taken by the kidnapper, or kidnappers, he or they have never been identified. One last thing to note about this case is that a co-worker of Mary's was murdered 18 months after Mary disappeared. Diane Shields was last seen leaving work in May 1967, and later that night her body was found in the trunk of her car. She suffocated to death after someone shoved a scarf down her throat. It's unclear if the two cases are connected. However, some investigators find it odd that two young women who worked at the same bank went missing and were murdered within 18 months of each other. Just like Mary's disappearance, the murder of Diane Shields is currently unsolved. Number 2. Dorothy Jane Scott. In early 1980, 32-year-old single mother Dorothy Jane Scott of Anaheim, California, was having a problem with a stalker. The man would call her at work, and she said that the voice was familiar, but she couldn't place it. Sometimes the caller would be nice, but other times he'd be violent and menacing. He also said that he was following her. To prove that he wasn't joking, he told Dorothy some personal details about herself. The calls unnerved Dorothy, and she even took self-defense classes. On the evening of May 28, 1980, Dorothy dropped off her son at her parents' house and then went to a staff meeting at her work, which was a head shop across the road from Disneyland. At the meeting, she noticed that her co-worker, Conrad Bostron, was not looking well. Specifically, his arm had become red and swollen. Dorothy drove Bostron and another co-worker, Pamela Head, to the UC Irvine Medical Center. It turned out that Bostron had been bitten by a black widow spider. When Bostron was released from the hospital, Head stayed with him while he signed some papers, and Dorothy went to bring the car up to the hospital's entrance. When Head and Bostron walked out of the hospital, they waited for a few minutes before they saw Dorothy's car speed towards them, but it didn't stop. Instead, it turned right out of the parking lot and drove off into the night. At first, Bostron and Head thought that Dorothy must have had some type of emergency with her son and had to leave, so they waited 2 hours at the hospital, and when they realized that she wasn't coming back, they called her parents, but her parents hadn't heard from her. The police were notified, and a few hours later, Dorothy's car was found engulfed in flames in an alley a few miles from the hospital. For some reason, the police did not want the Scott family to discuss the case with the media. The Scotts agreed, but about a week after Dorothy's disappearance, her mother, Vera, received a disturbing phone call. The caller asked, "Are you related to Dorothy Scott?" Vera replied yes, and the caller said, "I've got her." And then he hung up the phone. 2 weeks after Dorothy went missing, her father spoke to a reporter at a local newspaper. On the day that the story appeared in the newspaper, the editor received a call from a man who said, "I killed her. I killed Dorothy Scott. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I killed her." The caller also described what she was wearing on the day that she went missing, and he even told the editor why Dorothy was at the hospital on the night that she disappeared. The caller continued to harass the family for the next 4 years. The calls came on Wednesdays, which was the day of the week that Dorothy disappeared. Usually they came during the day when Vera was home alone. The caller would sometimes say that he killed Dorothy, or other times he would say that he had her. Or he would call and ask, "Is Dorothy there?" The police tried to trace the calls, but the kidnapper never stayed on the line long enough. In April 1984, the caller took a break from harassing the family, but then months later, in August, a construction worker in North Anaheim was doing some digging when he came across the skeleton of a dog. Buried under the dog bones were human remains. The remains were identified a week later as Dorothy Jane Scott. Also in the grave was Dorothy's watch, which had stopped at 12:30 a.m., May 29, 1980, which is about an hour after she was last seen at the hospital. The killer may have buried Dorothy under the dog to throw off police searches. If the police used cadaver dogs and they found a dead dog, they may have just assumed that the dog smelled the remains of the dead dog and might not have dug any deeper, effectively hiding Dorothy's remains. Dorothy did not have a dog with her when she went missing, and the police have no idea where the killer got the dog from. After the body was found, the killer called the family again. When her parents were out planning her funeral, her brother got 2 calls. Both times the man asked, "Is Dorothy there?" The calls finally came to an end after that. The police are sure that the man who stalked Dorothy is responsible for her murder, and he is also the same man that harassed the family while she was missing. Unfortunately, he has never been identified. Number 1. Danny Barter. On June 18, 1959, 4-year-old Danny Barter was camping with 6 other family members on the banks of Perdido Bay, which is about an hour away from their home in Mobile. Sometime between 9:30 and 10 a.m., Danny went missing. He was barefoot and only wearing shorts. He was also drinking a knee-high soft drink. The area was searched, but Danny couldn't be found. The initial theory from the police was that Danny was attacked by an animal. The area where the family was camping had alligators and snakes nearby. 2 alligators were gutted, but their stomach didn't contain any human remains. In fact, there was no trace of the 4-year-old boy anywhere in the area. Not even his soft drink bottle was found. Since there was no trace of Danny, the family and the police concluded that he was most likely kidnapped. Quite possibly he was kidnapped by someone who had been stalking the family for about a month. Danny's mother, Maxine Barter, first noticed a man sitting in a car watching their house about a month before the family went camping. When Maxine went to confront the man, he hid his face behind a newspaper and then drove away. A few weeks later, the neighbors spotted a man looking through a window into the bedroom where Danny and his brothers slept. The neighbors went to confront the man, but he ran away. However, he did leave behind a clue. Under the window, in the mud, was a pair of footprints. The sheriff's office was called, and caster molds of the footprints were made. Finally, the day before Danny went missing, Maxine and her sons drove to a store. Maxine left the boys in the car while she ran inside the store. When she left the car, a man pulled up beside the Barter's car, and he watched the boys for a few minutes without saying a word, and then he drove away before Maxine came back out. Sadly, it's been nearly 60 years since Danny disappeared, and he has never been found. His family is still looking for answers as to what happened to him. Number 5. Gloria Bielby. Gloria Bielby of Hull, England, used to work as a glamour model, but in the winter of 1979, She was working as a secretary at a multinational consumer goods company. She was married to a butcher named Bernard, and they had an 11-year-old son. Gloria was a dedicated mother, but there were rumors that she wasn't a faithful wife, and she was supposedly dating a few men. In January 1979, Gloria started getting obscene phone calls. The calls unsettled her so much that she didn't like to be alone. On the evening of February 1st, 1979, Bernard gave Gloria £3,500 to go buy a new car. Around 11:30 the next morning, a neighbor saw Gloria leaving her house. She was picked up by a middle-aged man who was well dressed, and he was driving a red Ford Escort. The neighbor thought that she saw Gloria put a suitcase in the trunk of the car. Gloria then got into the man's car and they drove off. What happened to her next is unknown. She never returned home, and she hasn't contacted anyone in her family, not even her son. The police have no idea what happened to Gloria. They don't know if she ran off with the £3,500 and started a new life, or if she had an accident, or if she committed suicide, or if she met with foul play. One theory that the police do have is that she was killed by her jealous husband, Bernard the Butcher. There is a rumor among the people of Hull that Bernard disposed of her body in his butcher shop. Some people even say he sold her meat to the customers. Another possibility is that she was killed by the stalker who was making the obscene phone calls. Of course, the man with the Ford Escort is also a suspect. Unfortunately, neither of them have been identified, and it's even possible that they are the same person. When the police reopened the case in 2013, they said that they would look at it from every angle. They would like to talk to the mysterious man with the Ford Escort and the person who was stalking her before she disappeared. Until they do, they most likely will not find out what happened to Gloria Bielby. Number 4. Sabrina Long. In the summer of 1991, 19-year-old Sabrina Long of Macon, Georgia, was working the afternoon shift at a local manufacturing plant. At the time, she was living with her stepfather, who was separated from her mother. Sabrina and her mother didn't get along while they lived in the same house, so Long moved in with her stepdad. After she moved out, their relationship improved. During that summer of 1991, Long received several unusual phone calls. Many of them were obscene. One call was from a local company, and they wanted to interview Long for a job. It was a good company, and Long was excited about the prospect of working there. When she called back to confirm the interview, a representative at the company told her there was no record of anyone calling her for an interview. On the night of August 13th, 1991, Long finished work at 11 p.m. On that night, she was using her boyfriend's Camaro because her car was having problems. She picked up her boyfriend, and he dropped her off at her stepfather's home. Sometime between 12:30 and 1:30 a.m., Long phoned her mother. After chatting for a few minutes, Long told her mother that she was going to run over to a neighbor's house because she wanted to see a gift that he had purchased for his mother. She asked her mother to call her back in half an hour, but her mother said she would be asleep at that point. When Long's stepfather returned home at 3 a.m., he found the lights on, but Long wasn't in the house. He just assumed that she was spending the night at her boyfriend's, and he went to bed. When she didn't show up for work or pick up her paycheck, her family knew something was wrong. They looked in her room and they found her work uniform on the floor. She also left behind some money and her makeup. One of the first people that the police interviewed was the neighbor that Long went to see on the night that she went missing. The neighbor said that he hadn't purchased anything for his mother, and he didn't talk to Long on the night that she disappeared. The police looked into his alibi, and they were able to rule him out as a suspect. They were also able to eliminate Long's stepfather and boyfriend as suspects. One suspect is the person who was calling Long before she disappeared. What makes the phone calls so much stranger is that they didn't stop after she disappeared. Shortly after she disappeared, Long's stepfather found a message on his answering machine. The caller was a woman who claimed to be Long, and she said that she needed help. Long's mother listened to the message, and she said that the caller wasn't her daughter. Then, months later, Long's mother found a message on her answering machine. It was a man calling from the insurance company, Geico. He wanted to set up a time for a job interview for Long, and he left his name and his number. Long's mother was confused because she didn't know that Long applied for a job there. She called the man back, and when she did, a representative at Geico told her that no one had called her to set up a job interview. The whereabouts of Sabrina Long and the identity of the caller are both unknown to this day. Number 3. Leon Moncer. In the winter of 1982, 21-year-old Leon Moncer of Bel Air, Ohio, was working 3 jobs. He had a young daughter, and he was married to a woman named Irene Zimmerman, but the couple was going through a divorce that winter. During the divorce, Moncer was dating another woman, and he was living with Zimmerman. Both women said that Moncer drank heavily, and he had a bad temper. They both said that on a few occasions, he got physically violent with them. In early 1982, Moncer started acting worried and nervous. He also became overprotective of his 3-year-old daughter, Julie. He didn't want her to leave the house without him, and he wouldn't allow anyone to take pictures of her. In February 1982, someone left a note in Moncer's mailbox. It was made from letters cut from magazines. It said, "Leave it alone or you're dead." Moncer shrugged off the threat and threw out the letter. Several days after receiving the note, on February 21st, Moncer said that he was going out for the evening, and he took off in his gray Dodge Aspen. Moncer didn't return home that night or any other night. His car was found abandoned not far from his home 5 days after he went missing. The driver's door was open, and the keys were in the ignition. Inside the car was his coat, which is something you shouldn't go very far without in the winter in Ohio, and also in the car were his cigarettes. Moncer's family said that he never went anywhere without his cigarettes. The interior of the car was covered in mud, and it looked like there had been a struggle. The family thought that the police would want to examine the car, but they told the family to take it home. In the months that followed, 3 people swore that they saw Moncer, but these sightings were never confirmed. Moncer's wife, Irene Zimmerman, also reported some strange occurrences. She said that for 6 months after the disappearance, she and the daughter that she had with Moncer were being followed by a man in a pickup truck. Then, for 2 years, a man in a dark hooded sweatshirt would hang out in the shadows and watch her house. She said that she could never see the man's face because it was always hidden by the hood. Zimmerman sometimes wondered if the man who was watching the house was Moncer and he was really alive. While she was being stalked, Zimmerman received an unsettling phone call. The caller asked her if she wanted to know what happened to Moncer, and she said yes. The caller said that his head was in a garbage bag in a river, and then his arms and his legs were in a strip mining pit. The sheriff's department lost Moncer's case file for several years, but it was found again in 2007. Cold case investigators are looking into the disappearance, but they are no closer to figuring out what happened to Leon Moncer. His daughter Julie says that she doesn't remember her father, but she has felt his presence her entire life. She says that it feels like he is alive, but admits that she may just feel that way because she hopes that he is still alive. Number 2. Jodie Bordeaux. Sean Bordeaux met the woman who would become his wife, Jodi, while he was attending the University of Nebraska. The couple got married in October 1995, and at the wedding, Sean got a job offer from a relative. It was to be the marketing director at the newly opened Golden Eagle Casino, which is a native casino near Horton, Kansas. Jodi also got a job at the casino, and she worked her way up to the role of supervisor of the slot machine area. As a supervisor, Jodi had to do a lot of the hiring and firing. Because she fired people, she obviously had a few people who didn't like her. Another problem is that several people didn't like that she got the supervisor job. They felt that someone from the local native tribe should have gotten the job. Then, in early 1997, Jodi herself was fired from the casino. She was let go because she showed up late every day for a week. Shawn said she shouldn't have been fired because she made up all the time that she missed. The reason that she was late every day was because she was getting fertility treatments in a different town. Shawn and Jodi were having problems conceiving. Jodi had suffered 2 miscarriages, and then they turned to the fertility treatments. After she had been fired, in the spring of 1997, Jodi learned that she was pregnant and that she was going to have a girl. Both Shawn and Jodi were excited about the pregnancy. Jodi also decided to fight for her job at the casino. When rumors started to swirl that she might return to her job in the fall of 1997, strange things started to happen. When Jodi was home alone, late at night, she would get phone calls where the caller would hang up as soon as she answered the phone. Then, one night while he was at work, Shawn got a frantic phone call from Jodi. She was sure that someone was lurking in the backyard of their house in Powhatan, Kansas. Shawn told Jodi to calm down and that it was probably just a raccoon or a coyote. When he returned home later that night, he found Jodi spooked but unharmed. A short time later, on November 21st, Jodi and Shawn went out for dinner and they bought some new clothes for the baby. Jodi was 7 months pregnant at the time. At 12:40 a.m., the couple was sitting in their living room, and that's when they heard a series of loud pops. The couple decided to figure out the source of the pops, so Shawn went to the kitchen and Jodi went to the bedroom. After the popping sound stopped, Shawn started to walk back to the living room, but on his way, he saw his wife's feet sticking out of the bedroom. He rushed to the bedroom and saw that Jodi had a small hole in her forehead just above her left eyebrow. The pops that they heard were a barrage of bullets that were fired into their house. Shawn knew that it was too late to save Jodi, but he put a tube sock over the wound and he called 911, hoping that the baby could be saved. Sadly, the baby didn't survive the shooting either. The police were never able to make an arrest, but they have 3 potential suspects. They think that the shooting and the stalking stem from someone who had an axe to grind with Jodi over employment issues. The gun has never been found, but some shell casings were found at the scene. The police think that they were fired from an SKS automatic rifle. At the time, Jodi and Shawn's house was on a Native American reservation, so the FBI was not allowed to aid in the investigation. Unfortunately, nearly 20 years later, the murders of Jodie Bordeaux and her unborn baby remain unsolved. Number 1. Beverly Jarosz. 16-year-old Beverly Jarosz liked art, she wrote poetry, and she volunteered as a typist at a local hospital. By all accounts, Beverly was popular, intelligent, and kind-hearted. Many of the young men in her neighborhood found her attractive. In 1964, Beverly and her family were living in the Garfield Heights neighborhood of Cleveland. During that year, there were some strange occurrences that really disturbed Beverly. Someone, or possibly several people, would call the family's home and then hang up when they picked up. Sometimes there would be 10 to 12 hang-up calls a day. Then, one day in the summer, a member of the Jarosz family found a box wrapped in a blue ribbon on their back doorstep. The tag said, "To Bev," but no one had signed it. Inside the box, there was a silver ring and a bracelet. One night, Beverly's father came home, and he saw a man staring up into the bedroom that Beverly shared with her sister. The man ran off, and her father chased him for a block, but he managed to escape. The strange episodes made Beverly jumpy. She always locked the door behind her when she came into the house. Anywhere she went, or if she was home alone, she would call to check in with her parents. She even bought a brass letter opener and kept it nearby. December 28, 1964 was a snowless day in Cleveland, and the temperature hung around the freezing mark. On that day, Beverly and her younger sister went to their grandmother's house for lunch. After lunch, her sister stayed at her grandmother's house, and Beverly was given a ride home by a young man who was a neighbor of her grandmother's. He dropped Beverly off at her house at around 12:30. That afternoon, Beverly was planning on going shopping with her friends Barbara and Margie. While she was at home, Beverly received 3 phone calls. The first call came in around 12:30, and it was someone from a department store calling to say that her mother's necklace had been fixed. Beverly called her mother at work to pass along the message. After that, there was a call from a man who was looking for her father. Beverly wrote down the message. The man said that his name was Steve Stakowicz and he would call back. Then, at 1:20, her grandmother called to check in to make sure she got home okay. Beverly answered the phone, but said she had to go because Barbara was at the door. Barbara was actually running a few minutes late, and her mother dropped her off at Beverly's house at 1:25. The storm door was closed, but the door to the house was open. Barbara thought that this was odd because Beverly always locked the door behind her. She definitely wouldn't have left the door open on a cold winter day. She rang the doorbell, but Beverly didn't come to the door. There was loud classical music playing in the house, and Barbara thought that the music was so loud that Beverly couldn't hear the doorbell. Barbara tried to open the storm door, but it was locked. She rang the doorbell again, and then she heard a loud bang upstairs in the house. It sounded like a piece of furniture fell over. When Beverly didn't come to the door, Barbara just assumed that she was mad at her for being late, so she walked home. When Beverly and Barbara didn't show up at Margie's house, Margie called Barbara and asked her what happened. Barbara told her that Beverly wouldn't come to the door. So Margie called Beverly's house, and there was no answer. Margie then called Beverly's grandmother to see if she was there. Her grandmother said she hadn't spoken to her since she called earlier that afternoon. So her grandmother called her father, who rushed home from work. He found a door at the side of the house open. He walked in and went upstairs to Beverly's bedroom. Inside, he found a scene that was as horrifying as it was heartbreaking. The police were called and they were horrified by the crime scene. The medical examiner and the lead detective, who later became the chief of police in Cleveland, both said that it was the worst murder that they had ever seen. Someone had strangled her with a clothesline and stabbed her over 50 times with a knife that was 3 to 4 inches long. The medical examiner said that most of the stab wounds were in patterns of 3. Despite the extensive amount of stab wounds, the actual cause of death was strangulation. Although she had been found naked, Beverly had not been sexually assaulted. The police think that Beverly knew her killer. Beverly always locked the doors to the house, yet there were no signs of a break-in, nor were there any indications that there was a struggle anywhere in the house except for the bedroom. An assistant prosecutor who worked on the case pointed out that the killer had a very small window of opportunity to commit the murder. Beverly had only been home for about an hour. During that time, she was on the phone with 4 different people for several minutes. If the killer had come to the house just minutes later, or Barbara arrived a few minutes earlier, Beverly wouldn't have been home because she would have left with Barbara. There is also speculation that Barbara interrupted the attack by ringing the doorbell, and that's why Beverly wasn't sexually assaulted. The police think it's odd that the killer brought 2 weapons with him. The clothesline was tied in a square knot, and it was most likely tied in the knot before he got to the house. He attacked her from behind by slipping the clothesline over her head. The knife has never been found, and no, it was not the brass letter opener. Since the killer brought 2 different weapons with him, and he had such a tight window of opportunity to commit the murder, and he was able to get away without being seen in broad daylight, the police are certain that the attack had been planned and he had been stalking Beverly. The police tried to track down Steve Stakowicz, who called the Jarosz' house just minutes before Beverly was murdered. They concluded that it was a fake name, and the caller was probably the killer, checking to see if Beverly was home alone. The police had many suspects, including the young man who drove Beverly home after she had lunch at her grandmother's, her boyfriend, her ex-boyfriend, other boys in the neighborhood who liked her, and even a creepy door-to-door salesman. Unfortunately, none of the suspects panned out, and the case grew cold over the years. One odd thing did happen 7 years after the murder. The Jarosz family was still living in the same house where their daughter had been murdered. One day, when they were at a funeral for a neighbor, someone broke into the house. Only one thing was stolen, a gold watch. It looked like someone broke into the house to look for something. 2 prints that were framed and were hanging up on a wall were taken down and their backing was torn out. The prints were copies of 2 of Beverly's favorite paintings. What the person was looking for, and if they found it, is a mystery. Beverly's mother is still alive, but she doesn't hold out much hope that the murder will be solved. She said that over the past 50 years she had one dream about Beverly, but thinks about her every day. Her sister said she had lots of dreams about Beverly. In her dreams, she always finds Beverly, but then loses her in a big group of people. In March 2017, the police announced that they had 2 prime suspects and DNA from the crime scene. In order to compare the DNA to the suspects, the police need someone with first-hand knowledge of the murder to come forward. If someone does come forward, the police may be able to close the books on one of the most haunting, unsolved mysteries in Cleveland's history. Number 3. Ricky Blake. On March 14, 1986, Ricky Blake celebrated her 14th birthday. She lived on a quiet street in Chula Vista, California with her parents, Bill and Alicia, and her older sister, who was also named Alicia, but went by the nickname Bootsy. Ricky's friends and family said that she was an innocent and naive 8th grade girl. She had a boyfriend, but they mostly talked over the phone, and they had never kissed. Ricky played with Cabbage Patch dolls, and she dressed the dolls in pajamas every night before bed. At about 10 p.m. one night in the spring of 1986, the phone rang in the family's home. One of Bootsy's friends answered the phone. The caller said that his name was George and he was looking for Ricky. The friend thought that George sounded like a man and he was too old to call someone Ricky's age. She told him that, and then hung up the phone. This wasn't the only phone call from the man named George. The family had received other phone calls from him, and some of them were obscene. On April 10, 1986, about a month after Ricky's birthday, Bill picked up Ricky at school to take her to the dentist. They returned home that night, and Ricky complained that her teeth hurt. For dinner, Ricky had soup and ice cream. Otherwise, it was an average Thursday evening in the Blake household. Sometime between 9 and 9:30, Bill and Alicia went to bed. Ricky stayed up to watch the San Diego Padres game. Bootsy had been out that evening with friends. At 10:30 p.m., she returned home, and she had 2 friends with her. Ricky stepped outside to talk with the 3 girls. A few minutes later, the friends left, and Ricky and Bootsy went inside. Ricky then got on a 3-way phone call with her boyfriend and one of her friends. While Ricky talked on the phone, Bootsy locked the front and back door. She then made Ricky get off the phone. Sometime between 11 and 11:30 p.m., the phone rang and Bootsy answered it. The caller asked for Ricky. He said his name was George. Bootsy knew two Georges, but the caller didn't sound like either George that she knew. In fact, she didn't recognize the voice. Ricky got the phone from her sister, and then she went into her bedroom. Bootsy then went to bed. The next morning, Ricky's mother, Alicia, woke up at 5 a.m. She went into the living room where she found the lights and the television on. The front door was also open. She went into Ricky's bedroom, and she wasn't there. It was apparent that she didn't sleep there that night because her bed was still made. Also, her Cabbage Patch dolls had not been changed into their pajamas. Perhaps what was most baffling was that Ricky's shoes were beside the front door. Her mother reasoned that if she went out for a walk, or even ran away from home, she would have at least taken her shoes. Ricky's parents called neighbors and friends, but no one had seen Ricky, so they called the police. That night, at around 10:10 p.m., a call came in to the police. A motorist had found the dead body of a teenage girl lying on an off-ramp to Interstate 5 in San Diego County, about 6 miles from Ricky's home. The body was identified as 14-year-old Ricky Blake. She was wearing black pants and a pink sweatshirt, which were the clothes that she was wearing when her family last saw her alive. She wasn't wearing any shoes, and her socks were dirty. An autopsy was performed, and the cause of death was most likely strangulation, but she may have also been suffocated. There was fluid in her lungs, so it's even possible that she might have been drowned. Ricky had bruises on her face and head. It is thought she was punched, hit with a bottle, or her head was slammed into a flat surface. Ricky had a blood alcohol level of 0.4, which is a level that usually leads to unconsciousness. The medical examiner said that this could have been the result of decomposition, or she may have been force-fed alcohol. Before she died, Ricky had been sexually assaulted. The medical examiner thought that she had been killed at about 1 a.m. on the day that her body was found. The police determined that she was most likely killed elsewhere and then dumped on the off-ramp. The police never did find where Ricky was killed, and the lack of a crime scene hampered their investigation. Their strongest lead was the phone calls from the man named George. The police interviewed students at Ricky's school, and some of them said that a man named George had called them as well. But no one knew who George was. Shortly after Ricky's murder, her family started to receive strange phone calls. Their home phone number was unlisted. The caller, who was male, would ask if Ricky was there, and then he would laugh and hang up. Another time, he called and played Ricky's favorite song, With You All the Way by New Edition. Then the calls died off, but the caller didn't stop harassing Ricky's family. Ricky's birthday was March 14th, and days before her first birthday after her murder, the calls started again. The person continued to call for a month, up to the anniversary of Ricky's murder. He would call at 3 or 4 in the morning, and he would only talk to Ricky's mother, Alicia. Any time that Ricky's father Bill would answer the phone, the caller would hang up. When Alicia talked to him, he would ask her if she wanted to know how Ricky died. Alicia would say she didn't want to know that, she just wanted to know who killed her. On other calls, he would recount Alicia's movements. He told her he watched her as she left her house, and he would say that he saw her at the cemetery. These calls happened every year for about a decade, and then they tapered off. Alicia said at first the calls used to frighten her. She even sent Bootsy to live with relatives out of fear that she might be harmed. But after a while, she became less frightened because she felt dead inside, and she thought that there was no way she could be hurt further. She said she actually started looking forward to the calls because she was hoping that he may say something that would lead to an arrest. But he never did. The police tapped the family's phone, but they were never able to identify the caller. Besides the phone calls, Ricky's family also noticed other unusual happenings. For example, they stored Ricky's clothes in boxes that were labeled with her name in their garage. The family discovered that someone had stolen clothes from the boxes. They also found odd things at her grave. One time they found a necklace with a heart pendant. Another time they found some loose change on her grave. Finally, they found a vase on her headstone. Inside the vase was what appeared to be strips of a man's shirt. Ricky's family wasn't sure if the stolen clothing, the items left at the gravesite, and the phone calls were connected. However, since the caller knew their unlisted phone number, knew where they lived, and knew where Ricky was buried, they thought it was definitely possible that one person was stalking them. But they also didn't know if it was just some disturbed person who was harassing them, or if he really was connected to Ricky's murder. But again, they thought it was possible. Before Ricky was murdered, George seemed to be stalking her. He had called their family's unlisted numbers several times. Just hours before she was killed, he had called the house. Since Ricky's shoes were found inside her house, the police assumed that she was kidnapped from her home. When George called, he may have lured her outside. That meant that George knew her address as well as her phone number. But Ricky's family couldn't be sure if George was the same person who called after the murder. Then in February 2003, nearly 17 years after Ricky was killed, the police made an arrest. They had matched DNA found in Ricky's underwear to a man named George Williams Jr. Williams had a horrifying criminal record. Williams was from Gary, Indiana, but in the mid-1980s, he was living in San Diego, California. In 1984, he was arrested for sexually abusing his 6-year-old daughter. In December of that year, he pleaded guilty to lewd acts with a minor under the age of 14. It's unclear what his sentence was, but in 1986, when Ricky was murdered, he was out on parole. A week after Ricky was killed, Williams was visiting his ex-wife at her apartment in San Diego. He had been drinking heavily that night. He left his ex-wife's apartment and he happened upon a woman who lived a few doors down from his ex-wife. Williams followed the woman into her apartment. Williams was armed with a knife and he tied her up. He then sexually assaulted her. When he was done, he went into the bedroom of the woman's 6-year-old daughter and he sexually assaulted her as well. After he was done, he fell asleep and the woman was able to free herself from her binds. She picked up her daughters and got out of the apartment. She then called 911 and the police arrived minutes later. They found Williams asleep in the woman's apartment and he was promptly arrested. For the 2 sexual assaults, Williams was sentenced to 17 years in prison and he ended up serving 12 years. After Williams was released from prison, he moved back to Gary, Indiana. In 1998, he was arrested again. This time it was for sexually abusing his 13-year-old nephew. He served 4 years in prison for that crime. He was arrested for the murder of Ricky about a year after he was paroled. In early 2005, Williams went to trial for Ricky's murder. In court, several witnesses testified that they saw Williams at a roller rink where Ricky and her sister were known to frequent. This is where it's believed that Ricky and Williams crossed paths. It is thought that on the night that Ricky was killed, Williams called her and lured her outside. He then kidnapped her, sexually assaulted her, killed her, and then dumped her body. Williams' lawyer said that Williams and Ricky had consensual sex before she died, and that's how his DNA ended up in her underwear. His lawyer then went on to say that there was no evidence that Williams killed Ricky. The jury ultimately found George Williams Jr. guilty, and he was sentenced to death. Since Williams was incarcerated starting a week after Ricky's murder, he could not have been the person who harassed and stalked Ricky's family in the 10 years after her murder. But who that person was and why he chose to torment Ricky Blake's family is still unknown. Number 2. Carol Ann Jackson and Janet Brown. Carol Ann Jackson lived alone in an isolated cottage in Woodburn Green, Buckinghamshire, England. The 50-year-old ran an antique shop out of her home. On April 13, 1997, neighbors of Jackson had not seen her in 2 days, so they went to her house to check on her. They found her dead body inside her home, and they called the police. The medical examiner determined that 2 days before her body was found, Jackson had been hit in the head several times with a blunt object. The medical examiner was not able to determine what that object was. The cause of death was asphyxiation, but there were no marks on her neck. So she may have been smothered with something like a pillow, or she could have been left unconscious face down on the floor, and she suffocated that way. Jackson's wrists and ankles were bound. There were no signs of sexual assault. One theory that the police had regarding the murder was that she was killed by an opportunist thief. On April 11th, the day that Jackson was killed, she was visiting a friend who lived about 40 miles from her own home. On her way home, Jackson stopped at an ATM and she withdrew £500. The police think that someone saw her withdraw the money and they followed her home. When she got home, she went inside and called her friend to tell her that she had arrived home safely. After hanging up, she went back to her car and started to collect items to bring inside. She was attacked there and she was forced back inside her home. She was then bound and assaulted by the killer. The police thought that the killer might have tortured Jackson in an effort to get her to explain how to get into her safe, where there was some jewelry. The killer ended up stealing the £500 and a Rolex that Jackson was wearing, but it's not believed that he got into the safe. However, not everyone is convinced that Jackson was killed by someone who happened to see her withdraw money at an ATM. They think she may have been killed by someone who had been stalking her for a couple of months. In February, about 2 months before the murder, Jackson was driving home and she was sure that someone was following her. She called her neighbor and he was outside her house waiting for her when she got home. He didn't see anyone following her, but Jackson was pretty frightened. She ended up calling the police and reporting the incident. Several weeks later, Jackson was out running some errands, and when she arrived home, she saw a man standing outside of her house. She called the police, and they brought search dogs, but they couldn't find anything of interest. Jackson was concerned about her safety, and she had a home security system. One amazing aspect about the murder is the timing. When Jackson arrived home after visiting her friend, she turned off the security system and called her friend. Jackson probably would have turned the alarm back on while she was home alone, but since she was going back to her car to retrieve some items, she didn't reactivate the alarm. In this tiny window of time, she was attacked and killed. It's possible that an opportunist thief may have just gotten lucky. Or it's possible that someone who was stalking her saw this as their best opportunity to attack her. Unfortunately, since there has never been an arrest, it's not known if either theory is true. Both the police and the media saw a connection between Carol Ann Jackson's murder and a murder that happened 2 years earlier to the day that Jackson was killed. Janet Brown lived in a large farmhouse in Radnage, Buckinghamshire, about 20 miles from where Carol Ann Jackson lived. She and her family had purchased the house in the mid-1980s. Like Jackson's house, the Browns' home was quite isolated. Their closest neighbors were several hundred feet away. A few years after they moved in, there was a rash of break-ins in the neighborhood, so Janet set up a neighborhood watch. She also had a security system installed in her house, and she bought a Great Dane. In the spring of 1995, Janet and her husband, Graham, put their house up for sale. They were planning on moving to Canada. On the morning of April 12, 1995, a contractor and his son arrived at the house to do some work. As they approached the house, they noticed that an alarm was ringing. The lights were on in the house, and there was 2 cars parked in the driveway. The contractor and his son knocked on the front door, but no one answered. They looked through a window, and they saw the naked body of 51-year-old Janet Brown lying at the bottom of the stairs. They went and called the police. Janet had been beaten in the back of the head with a blunt object. The medical examiner thought that she had been struck at least 10 times. The murder weapon wasn't found, but it was believed to have been a crowbar. Janet's hands were handcuffed behind her back. The keys to the handcuffs were found under her body. The medical examiner also determined that her ankles had been bound at some point. Brown packing tape had been wrapped around her head 9 times. The medical examiner said had she not been beaten to death, the tape would have caused her to asphyxiate to death. Although Janet was naked, the medical examiner did not find any signs of sexual assault. The police pieced together what they thought happened the day before Janet's body was found. Janet worked as a researcher at Oxford University's Department of Public Health and Primary Care. She went to work that day and came home to an empty house. Janet's husband, Graham, was a doctor, and he lived and worked in Switzerland. He came home once or twice a month for a day or two. Janet and Graham had 3 children, but only one lived at home. Their eldest daughter lived in London, and their only son was attending school in Exeter. Their youngest daughter, 17-year-old Roxanne, lived at home, but she was out that evening. She called home sometime that evening and told her mother that she was planning on sleeping over at her friend's house. A friend of Roxanne's called the Brown household at 8:10 p.m. and Janet answered. Then Graham called at 8:30 p.m. and there was no answer. The Browns had 2 alarm systems in their house. One is an external alarm which can be heard outside of the house. It would ring for 20 minutes, and then it would automatically turn off. The other alarm system was an internal alarm that was activated by 2 panic buttons. One panic button was in the master bedroom, and the other one was near the front door. The internal alarm could only be turned off by entering a code into a number pad. Unfortunately, neither alarm was hooked up to a system that would contact a security firm or the police. At about 10:20 p.m. on the night that Janet was killed, someone driving by her house heard the external alarm. At the time, they did not know what the alarm was, and they didn't report hearing it until after they learned about the murder. When the contractor and his son found Janet's body, the internal alarm was ringing. The police thought that the killer broke in around 10 p.m., and this triggered the external alarm. The police thought that the killer got into the house through a double-pane glass patio door. He cut a hole in the exterior window, and he smashed the interior window. The police theorized that Janet heard the glass smashing, and she went to investigate. The intruder grabbed her, handcuffed her, wrapped tape around her head, and then he beat her to death. They ruled that the murder was a burglary gone wrong. But a forensic psychologist named Paul Britton, who advised on the case, did not agree with that conclusion. He thought that the killer had been stalking Janet and possibly her daughter Roxanne. When the killer broke into the house, there were 2 cars parked outside, Janet and Roxanne's. Also, there were lights on inside the house. So the intruder had to suspect that someone was in the home when he broke in. If his goal was just to rob a house, why would he choose a house where someone was home? Also, if he suspected that someone might be home, why did he smash the window? This would have made a lot of noise and attracted the attention of anyone inside. This is a terrible way to break into a random house to rob it. What if the resident was trained in martial arts or was armed with a weapon? The unexpected sound of a window breaking would usually prompt someone to grab anything that they could use as a weapon. If someone wanted to rob a house where someone was home, then they would want to be as stealth as possible. Another worry that criminals have when breaking into a home is if the resident has a dog, especially a vicious guard dog. The Browns did have a Great Dane, but it died 18 months before the murder. Britton says that all this suggests that the person who killed Janet was stalking her. When the killer broke in, he probably just assumed that Janet and Roxanne would be there. After all, both of their cars were in the driveway. He may have been surprised that Roxanne wasn't there when he broke in. Roxanne's friend had picked her up, and she had only decided to spend the night at her friend's house earlier that evening. Britton also doesn't believe that the killer got into the house through the patio door. Experienced burglars will often cut a hole in a pane of glass that is big enough for them to put their hand through. Then they reach through the hole and unlock the door or the window. Janet's killer didn't do that. The patio window was double paned. Instead of cutting a small hole his hand could fit through, he cut a large man-sized hole in the exterior patio window. As for the interior pane, he didn't cut a hole in it. Instead, he just smashed it. What was odd was that there seemed to be more glass outside than inside. This suggests that the pane of glass was smashed from the inside. Also, had the killer gotten in that way, he would have stepped on broken glass, and pieces of glass would have been embedded in the treads of his footwear. He would have then tracked shards and traces of glass throughout the house. But the police did not find any traces of broken glass anywhere else in the house. Another problem that Bryn had with the crime scene is that if the killer broke in by smashing the patio window, and Janet was attacked when she went to investigate the noise, then why was she naked? If most people heard something like a window breaking while they were home alone and naked, they would put on some type of clothing and then go check the source of the noise. So Bryn thinks that the killer got in some other way and surprised Janet in her bedroom. He thinks that this happened sometime between 8:10 p.m. when Roxanne's friend called and Janet answered the phone, and 8:30 p.m. when Graham called and Janet didn't answer the phone. When the killer got to the master bedroom, Janet was either naked or he made her undress. Bryn said that even though Janet had not been sexually assaulted, it was still a sex crime. Bryn said he wanted to dominate her and feed off her fear. The killer probably had a fantasy he wanted to play out. The fantasy probably included handcuffing her and wrapping her head in tape. Bryn thought that Janet may have tried to run away, and this is how she ended up at the bottom of the stairs. The killer then ran after her and beat her in the head, probably with a crowbar. After killing Janet, he washed up and quite possibly showered. Bryn thinks it's highly possible that the killer brought a spare set of clothes and he changed into them after he washed himself. Bryn thinks this because there wasn't much blood found in other parts of the house. The only exceptions were watered-down bloodstains that were found on a light switch. Bryn also said that the killer was organized. Notably, he brought two types of tape with him. He used one type of tape when he cut a hole in the patio window, and he used a different tape to wrap around Janet's head. Neither roll of tape was in the house before the murder. He also brought the murder weapon with him, and he most likely brought a spare change of clothes with him. Bryn was also sure that the killer brought the handcuffs as well. The handcuffs were another clue that the murder was a sex crime, and not a burglary gone wrong. The killer had two rolls of tape with him, but he bound her wrists with the handcuffs. Bryn thought that the handcuffs were part of a specific fantasy that the killer had. Bryn believes that the killer remained in the house for nearly 2 hours. He thinks it's possible that the killer may have been waiting for Roxanne to come home. Bryn doesn't believe that Janet activated either the internal or the external alarm. The internal alarm had to be activated by one of two panic buttons. If Janet activated the alarm, then she obviously did it before she was killed. But yet, the killer stayed in the house after the murder to wash up, and he may have even possibly showered. If the alarm was ringing, he probably wouldn't have stuck around to wash up. He probably wouldn't have known that the alarm just rang and didn't alert a security company. Nor could he have been sure that the alarm wouldn't attract the attention of a neighbor who could have called the police. Basically, it would have been too risky to stay behind and wash up while the alarm was ringing. As for the external alarm, it was heard after 10 o'clock, which is about 2 hours after it's believed that the killer broke into the house. The alarm would only ring for 20 minutes, and then it would stop. If the alarm had triggered while the killer was breaking in, it probably would have scared him away, because he had no idea who might hear it, or who the alarm might notify. So Bryn thinks the killer cut and smashed the patio windows after the murder, and this triggered the external alarm. He also triggered the internal alarm as he left. This would have made it look like a random home robbery gone wrong, when it was, in fact, a targeted sex crime committed by a stalker. Bryn says the final clue that the home invasion wasn't a robbery was the fact that nothing was stolen from the house and there had been no ransacking. Bryn didn't think that this was the only crime that the killer committed. Bryn suggested looking for similarities in other sex crimes that were committed in the area. The police did that, but it did not lead to an arrest. The police also eliminated all the usual suspects, like Janet's husband, because he was in Switzerland when she was killed. The police found no evidence that Janet was having an affair, so they are fairly certain that she wasn't killed by a boyfriend. In 2015, the police announced that they had developed a DNA profile of Janet Brown's killer. They conducted mass screenings and also compared it to 300 individual suspects. Unfortunately, they did not find a match. There are several similarities between the murders of Carol Ann Jackson and Janet Brown. First off, they were murdered 2 years to the day of each other. Jackson was killed on April 11, 1995, and Janet was killed on April 11, 1997. They were also close in age. Jackson was 50 years old, and Janet was 51 years old. They were both killed in their isolated houses, which were about 20 miles apart. Both were bound and struck in the head, but not sexually assaulted. Finally, both murders are unsolved. It's not known with any certainty if the two cases are connected, and this may not be answered until there is an arrest in at least one of the cases. Number 1. Kanika Powell. Kanika Powell was born on the last day of January 1981. She attended high school in Largo, Maryland. She graduated in 1998, and in 2000, she joined the Army. She ended up serving a tour of duty in Korea. Back stateside, she got a job with Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory as a security contractor. What she did for work was top secret, and she couldn't even explain her job to her mother. Her mother knew that her work somehow involved the military, and at times she had to travel to different cities to pick up items. On the evening of August 23, 2008, Powell was at home in her apartment in Prince George County, Maryland. At around 7 p.m., there was a knock at the door. She asked who was there, and the person who knocked on the door didn't say anything. Powell went and looked through her peephole, and she saw a man standing in front of her door. She asked him what he wanted, and he said he was with the FBI. He then held up what looked like an FBI shield in front of the peephole. He addressed Powell by her full name, and he said that he wanted to talk to her about an investigation. Powell thought that the FBI shield looked fake, so she asked for some photo ID and a warrant. Instead of providing either item, the man just walked away. She then went into her bedroom, and through her window, she saw the man walking away from her building. She thought she heard a second man yell at him to go in the opposite direction. The incident frightened Powell, so she called 911. The police arrived minutes later, and they searched the area, but they did not find anything of interest. Powell was so freaked out by the incident that she wrote the following email and sent it to friends and family. I just wanted to share with you the scariest thing that happened to me this weekend. Saturday evening around 7 p.m., a man was knocking at my door. As all of you may know, I live alone. I asked who it was and he didn't answer, so once I got close to the door and looked at the people, I saw a male figure that was not familiar to me at all. I asked who he was, and all he stated was that he was from the FBI and that he was looking for Kanika Powell. It freaked me out completely because this man knew my name. He held up a shield but no picture ID, and he never gave his name. He told me he was looking for me in regards to an investigation. I told him I had no idea as to what he was talking about, and that he would need to show me documentation as well as a warrant of some sort. So he left, and I looked out my bedroom window and saw him walking. I also heard a voice tell him to walk in the opposite direction. The whole situation was scary and seemed so false. So because of this incident, not only did I get no sleep for the rest of the weekend, but I am now trying to get an alarm system installed in my apartment. I had one in my old apartment, but I just hadn't had it transferred over to my new one. As far as everything that happened with the guy, I did call the FBI, and they told me that it was more than likely bogus, because they never come to your door by themselves, and they always leave a card of some sort so that you can contact them. I called the local police as well to give them a description, just in case someone is out there trying to rape or harm single women. Pass this on, ladies. This is not a fake forward. This happened to me, Kanika. Who knows who these guys are, and what they are doing, and in what areas other than mine. 4 days later, at around 7 p.m., someone knocked on Powell's apartment door. Powell asked who was there. The man said he had a package for Kanika Powell. Powell looked through her people and saw that it was a different man than the one who claimed to be the FBI agent. Powell didn't open the door, and the man said he was going to get her package from his vehicle. But he didn't return. He also didn't leave a note. About 12 hours later, sometime between 7 and 7:30 a.m., someone knocked on her door again. The man said that he was there to deliver a package. Once again, Powell didn't answer the door, and the man went away. Powell was disturbed by the incident, and she called her mother to talk about it. Powell thought it was strange that someone was delivering a package that early in the morning. Powell had to go out of town the next day for work, and she needed to run some errands for her trip out of town. She didn't feel comfortable running her errands after work because she didn't want to go out when it was dark. She decided to take the day off work, and that morning she went out and did her errands. Just before 11:50 a.m., Powell returned home. Someone was waiting for her in her hallway. He shot her multiple times in the torso with a handgun and then fled. A neighbor heard the gunshots and called 911. Powell was found unconscious on the floor in front of the door to her apartment. She was rushed to the hospital, but she never regained consciousness. 28-year-old Kanika Powell was pronounced dead the next day. The police investigated the usual suspects first, but it was a dead end. Powell wasn't dating anyone, she didn't have any disgruntled exes, nor did she have any problems with rejected admirers. Her friends and family couldn't think of anyone who would have wanted to hurt her. Powell's keys and her wallet were lying beside her when she was found unconscious, so robbery didn't seem to be the motive. There has been some speculation that Powell's murder was connected to her top-secret job. This theory was bolstered by something that happened about 2.5 months after her murder. Like Kanika Powell, 31-year-old Sean Nicholas Green had top-secret security clearance. He did tech support at the National Counterterrorism Center. He worked with computers that had sensitive national security information. Green was single, and he had never been married. He was close with his family, and he adored his 8 young nephews. Green lived a quiet life, and he referred to himself as a square. Like Powell, no one could think of why anyone would want to hurt Green. On November 12, 2008, Green was shot to death in his car as he was waiting at a red light. He was killed about 25 miles away from Powell's apartment. Like Powell, he had been shot multiple times in the torso with a handgun. While it wasn't made public how many times Powell was shot, Green was shot 9 times. Green's brother said that he went to the gym around the same time every day. He was killed at the time he usually drove to the gym. He was also killed on the route he took to the gym. So it's thought that the killer stalked him enough to know his routine. Another explanation is that Green wasn't targeted and his murder was just a random act of violence, where he may have been killed in case of mistaken identity. Some people don't think that Green was randomly or accidentally murdered. They think that both Powell and Green were killed because of their work. But other people say that the connection is too loose. They both had top secret security clearance, but Powell and Green had completely different jobs and worked in different departments. Detectives who investigated Powell's murder don't think she was killed because of her work. One reason they believe this is because it doesn't seem like her murder was a professional hit. It's assumed that Powell was killed by one of the men who came to her door. By coming to her door multiple times, they could have exposed themselves. People could have seen them coming and going from the apartment. Green's murder seems more like a professional hit. He was killed while he was following his routine, and there were no witnesses. If Green thought he was being followed before he was killed, he didn't tell anyone. Since no arrest was made in either case, it's impossible to say with any certainty if the two murders are connected. Another theory about the murder of Kenneka Powell is that she was murdered by a serial killer. On the morning of June 24, 2008, the fire department was called to a house fire in Bowie, Maryland, which is in Prince George County. Inside the house, they found the dead body of 46-year-old Vilma Butler. Butler's death was not a result of the fire. Instead, she was shot in the torso, and then her house was torched. Butler's home was equipped with a sprinkler system, but it appeared to have been disabled before the fire was started. 2 months after Butler was killed, Kenneka Powell was shot multiple times in the torso outside of her apartment. 4 months after Powell's murder, at 2 a.m. on January 26, 2009, 16-year-old Carissa Lofton called 911. She whispered to the dispatcher that she needed help. She and her mother, 45-year-old Karen Lofton, had both been shot. First responders rushed to their home in Largo, Maryland, which is also in Prince George County. Sadly, they were too late. The mother and daughter were both dead by the time they arrived at their home. In the early morning hours of March 16, 2009, about a month after the Loftons were killed, the fire department was called to a vacant house in Logan. A stolen Nissan Maxima was on fire in the driveway. They put out the fire and discovered 2 bodies in the car. One was in the back seat, and the other was in the trunk of the car. The bodies were so severely burned that the fire department didn't even know what sex the victims were. The Nissan Maxima had been reported stolen just a few minutes before the fire department was called. Someone had broken into the owner's home and stolen the keys. While the owner of the car was on the phone with 911 reporting the robbery, she saw the car drive by, but she didn't get a good look at the driver. The next day, the police identified the bodies as 42-year-old Dolores DeWitt and her daughter, 19-year-old Ebony. Dolores and Ebony were reported missing shortly before their bodies were found. They were supposed to pick up a relative at the bus station, but they never did. The relative took a cab to their home and found the lights on, and their car was in the driveway. She called their cell phone several times, but they didn't answer. She got a bad feeling, so she reported them missing. It turned out that Dolores and Ebony had both been strangled to death. The police thought that the murders of Dolores and Ebony and Karen and Carissa were connected. Both sets of victims were mother and daughter. They lived within a mile of each other, and they were all killed in the early morning hours of a Monday. The police got their first lead in the murders several weeks later. The ATF was investigating the robbery of a gun store in Woodbine, Maryland. They learned from an informant that 27-year-old Jason Thomas Scott was involved in the robbery. Around the time of the murders, there had been a rash of break-ins and home invasions in Prince George County. When the police searched Scott's home, they found items that had been reported stolen from the break-ins and the home invasions. On a flash drive, they found photos of a teenage girl who had been sexually assaulted during one of the home invasions. Scott worked part-time at UPS. His job was to fix incorrect addresses on items that couldn't be delivered. The police checked the company's computer records. While Scott was working, someone had looked up the DeWitt's information on a computer. Two other searches that were performed while Scott was working caught the interest of the police. Someone had looked up the address of Vilma Butler and the address of the home where the Nissan Maxima was stolen from. The police searched a vacant house where Scott hid his burglary tools and the clothes he wore when he broke into people's homes. In the vacant house, they found burned remnants of the DeWitt's clothes. Scott often committed his crimes with an accomplice. Earlier on the night that the DeWitts were killed, Scott and a partner robbed a house that was just down the street from the DeWitt's house. His partner said that after the robbery, he dropped off Scott near the DeWitt's house. The police found other evidence that connected Scott to the murder of the DeWitts, and he was indicted on their murders a few weeks after he was arrested. The police suspected that he murdered Vilma Butler and Karen and Carissa Lofton as well, but they couldn't find any evidence to connect him to those murders, so he wasn't charged. In September 2013, Scott entered an Alford plea for the murders of Dolores and Ebony DeWitt. When someone takes an Alford plea, they are not pleading guilty, but they acknowledge that if they went to trial, the district attorney would have enough evidence to convict them. Scott also confessed to 28 home robberies, 9 armed home invasions, and a gun store robbery. He also admitted to selling stolen guns on the street. In total, for all his crimes, he received 179 years in prison. Scott is considered a suspect in Kanika Powell's murder for several reasons. First, at least 2 men knocked on Powell's door, and she thought that the fake FBI agent had another man with him when he came to her apartment building. Scott worked with accomplices on several of his crimes. Secondly, Scott worked at UPS, and it's thought that he found out information about his victims by using their computers. When the men came to Powell's door, one thing that really freaked her out was that they knew her name. Using the UPS computer system, Scott could have found out Powell's name based on her address. Also, 2 times, a man claiming to deliver a package knocked on her door. Scott could have got the idea to use this ploy from his day job. Powell's murder also happened right in the midst of Scott's killing spree. She was killed 2 months after Vilma Butler was murdered, and 4 months before Karen and Chris Lofton were killed. Powell, like Butler and the Loftons, was shot with a handgun, and Scott had access to many guns. Scott has never confessed to being involved in Powell's murder, and no evidence connects him to the crime. At the time of this video, Kanika Powell's murder remains unsolved, and the case is considered cold. The police think that Jason Thomas Scott may be responsible for murders in places he visited, like Washington, D.C., Texas, and Florida. Number 3. Tanya Loy. In mid-1982, 38-year-old Tanya Loy lived in Mesa, Arizona. She had moved to Arizona from Iowa City, Iowa, about 18 years earlier. Tanya had been married, but she and her husband got divorced. They had 2 sons together, Kevin and John. Tanya lived with Kevin, and John lived with his father. Tanya's ex-husband owned and operated an auto shop in Mesa. Tanya was a self-employed housekeeper. On the morning of June 18, 1982, Tanya told her 18-year-old son, Kevin, that she had to run some errands. She drove over to a friend's home, but her friend wasn't there. After that, Tanya seemingly vanished into thin air. She was reported missing when she didn't come home. 2 days later, her car, a 1975 Ford station wagon, was found abandoned in a restaurant parking lot just over 3 miles south of her home. Tanya's family told the police about 2 strange incidents. The first happened about a year earlier. As Tanya was driving on Superstition Boulevard in Apache Junction, a few miles from her home, someone fired a bullet through her passenger window. The bullet passed through the car without hitting Tanya. The second incident happened a few months later. Tanya was at home and someone rang her doorbell. Tanya opened the door and found a man who was dressed as a woman. The man sprayed Tanya in the face with some mace. Tanya pushed the man out of the doorway, but in the process, she fell. The assailant then proceeded to strike Tanya multiple times before running off. Tanya suffered facial injuries in the assault. Because of those 2 incidents, the police thought that Tanya's disappearance was the result of foul play. On July 24, 1982, just over a month after 38-year-old Tanya Loy went missing, 6 hunters were in the desert east of Florence, Arizona, about 60 miles from Tanya's home. They came across some fully clothed human remains. The remains were badly decomposed. Using dental records, the remains were identified as Tanya Loy. The mother of 2 had been stabbed to death. It appeared that she had been killed in the desert where her body was found. The time of death couldn't be determined, but she was most likely killed within a few days of her disappearance. The police do not have proof that the other 2 incidents are related to her murder, but they believe they are. That's because it appeared that someone was stalking and trying to harm Tanya, and then she ended up murdered. Unfortunately, no arrests have ever been made in the murder of Tanya Loy, and the case is largely forgotten. Number 2. Carla Corley. In the summer of 1980, Carla Corley was 14 years old. At the end of summer vacation, she was set to start the 7th grade. She lived with her mother in a community housing project in Birmingham, Alabama. Carla had an older sister Kat Poe, who didn't live with them. Carla called her sister most nights, but on the night of August 8, 1980, Carla didn't call. Poe called her mother's home, and her mother told her that Carla was at a friend's home. Carla didn't call Poe the next night or the night after that, so Poe went over to her mother's home. Her mother told her an unusual and disturbing story. She said on the night of August 8th, she and Carla were washing dishes. Then they sat down in the living room to watch TV. Her mother said she went to bed, but Carla continued to watch TV. Her mother said that at about 4:30 a.m., she got up and came out to the living room. Carla wasn't there. Her sandals were by the couch where she had taken them off the night before. In the kitchen, chairs had been knocked over and a soft drink bottle had been knocked over. The front door was wide open. Kat Poe and her mother reported Carla missing, but sadly, no trace of Carla Corley was found. Years went by and Carla's mother had her declared dead. A few years after that, a suspect had a story about what happened to Carla, but then he recanted his story. The police never found any evidence to back up his recanted confession. Then, 18 years after the disappearance, Carla's family told the police a disturbing story. Apparently, a month before Carla went missing, she was kidnapped by 3 men. They took her to an area near Lake Purdy, which is a lake in Birmingham. They spent several hours gang raping her. Then they brought her back home. A few weeks later, the 3 men went to Carla's home and tried to kidnap her again. But they couldn't get into the house, so they left. Neither incident was reported to the police. It's also not clear why the family took 18 years to tell the police about the incidents. It's also not known if the kidnapping and attempted kidnapping are related to her disappearance. It has been over 41 years since Carla Corley went missing from her home. No trace of her has ever been found. In May 2020, Kat Poe had a message for anyone who might have information regarding her sister's disappearance. She said, "Set yourself free. The truth is really what's going to release them, and let this be over for Carla." Number 1. Jodi Huisentruit. Jodi Huisentruit was born in June 1968 in Long Prairie, Minnesota, and she grew up there. In 1993, she got a job as the morning and noon anchor with the CBS affiliate KIMT in Mason City, Iowa. On June 26, 1995, Huisentruit played in a golf tournament. Huisentruit was a talented golfer who won tournaments in high school. That night, she went over to the home of a friend, John Van Cise. A few weeks earlier, it had been Huisentruit's 27th birthday. Van Cise had arranged a birthday party for her. He had a video of the party, and she came over to watch it. The next morning, at about 4 a.m., Huisentruit didn't show up for work. So a coworker called her apartment. Huisentruit answered, and she said she had overslept. She said she was on her way. But by 5 a.m., Huisentruit had not made it to the station. By 7 a.m., Huisentruit still had not made it to work, and she had not contacted any of her coworkers. So her coworkers called the police and asked them to do a welfare check. In the parking lot of Huisentruit's building, they found her car, a red Mazda Miata. They found several items scattered around her car, including a bent key, a hairdryer, a ball of hairspray, and red shoes. They also found a palm print on the car. The police thought that these were signs of a struggle. It appeared that Huisentruit was kidnapped and forced into a vehicle. But beyond that, there were no clues as to what happened to 27-year-old Jodi Huisentruit. After Huisentruit went missing, John Van Cise went to the police and told them that he saw her the night before, effectively making him the last person who saw her alive. He said he knew nothing about her disappearance. In March 2017, the police got a warrant for GPS data for his 2 vehicles, but no other action has been taken against him. John Van Cise has never been publicly identified as a suspect. One person who was identified as a suspect was a rapist named Tony Jackson. Jackson supposedly told a cellmate that he had killed Huisentruit and buried her body on a farm. The police searched the farm that Jackson talked about, and nothing was found. The police later said that Jackson was not a viable suspect. Another possibility is that someone became obsessed with Huisentruit while watching her on TV, and he started stalking her. In October 1994, about 10 months before Huisentruit disappeared, she was out jogging. As she jogged, a man driving a black truck started following her. The encounter freaked out Huisentruit so much that she reported it to the police. But the police never identified the driver of the black truck. Huisentrut's sister also said that shortly before she went missing, she was receiving strange phone calls. Also, if a predator was out prowling for a random victim, 4 a.m. in a city with a population of around 30,000 people isn't exactly the best time to be out hunting. But if someone knew Huisentrut's schedule, like a stalker, it would have been the perfect time to kidnap her. Clearly, because no one saw or heard Huisentruit being kidnapped. However, the stalker theory remains only that, a theory. No trace of Jodi Huisentruit has been found in the nearly 26 years since she went missing. Her friends and family hope that she'll be found and the person or people responsible for her disappearance will be brought to justice. Number 3. Gary Miller. In the summer of 1999, 43-year-old Gary Miller lived in Comrie Township, Pennsylvania. Miller had never been married. He lived with his mother and stepfather. He had 2 jobs. He was the night manager of a grocery store in Wyomissing, Pennsylvania, and he was a gospel music concert promoter. On August 6, 1999, Miller worked the late shift at the grocery store. Afterward, Miller and a coworker went out for dinner at a local diner. They finished at about 1 a.m. and Miller got into his car. His coworker noticed that when he pulled out of the parking lot, he drove in the opposite direction of his home. She thought it was strange, but didn't think much of it. Where Miller went is unknown. What is known is that he returned to the area about 45 minutes later. He parked his car in the parking lot of an adult bookstore that was open 24 hours a day. In the parking lot, someone approached his car and shot him several times, including once through the heart. Miller tried to drive away, but he only made it about 65 feet before going through a fence and then colliding with a tree. His body was found minutes after the shooting. The murder shocked the community. Gary Miller was a down-to-earth man whose passion was gospel music. Miller seemed like the last person to be shot to death in the parking lot of an adult bookstore. The police investigated the murder, and they learned that Miller believed he was being stalked. 2 weeks before the murder, Miller told his mother that he thought he was being watched. Miller also mentioned to a friend that he suspected that he was going to be blackmailed soon. But Miller never explained why he thought he was going to be blackmailed or what he was going to be blackmailed over. A week before the murder, Miller's mother heard him having an odd conversation on the phone. He said to the caller, "If they are right with the Lord, they don't have to be afraid to die." His mother never learned who he was speaking on the phone with. On the night Miller was murdered, Miller received 2 calls at work that unsettled him. After one call, his co-worker said he slammed the phone down and then he swore, which was extremely out of character. A short time later, another co-worker heard Miller talking on the phone. Miller asked the caller to come to the grocery store to speak with him. The caller didn't want to do this. The co-worker couldn't hear the other side of the call, but he made out that Miller agreed to meet the caller that night at a location the caller suggested. The police believed that the caller was either the killer or was working with the killer. During the second call, the caller most likely directed Miller to the parking lot where he was murdered. Unfortunately, the police have no leads in the case. The police do not know why Miller was stalked and harassed before his murder, but they believe it's connected to his murder. A few years after Miller's murder, the adult bookstore where he was killed was demolished. Miller's mother died in August 2009 without knowing who killed her son. Nearly 23 years after Gary Miller's murder, the case is hopelessly cold. The rest of the family and friends of the gospel music-loving man are hoping that his murder will eventually be solved. Number 2. Marilyn Lindsay. Marilyn Lindsay was born in January 1956 in Vancouver, British Columbia. She grew up in an exclusive area of Vancouver with her brother, Kent. Their father, Eric, was a celebrity photographer with the newspaper, The Vancouver Sun, and their mother, Marjorie, was a homemaker. In the late 1960s, the Lindsay family moved to Toronto, Ontario, because Eric got a job with the CBC, Canada's national public broadcaster. About 2 years after the move, Eric and Marjorie split up. Marjorie and Ken moved back to Vancouver, while Eric and Mariel stayed in the Toronto area. When Mariel was 18, her mental health deteriorated. She eventually had a nervous breakdown, and she was diagnosed as borderline psychotic. After that, she moved back to Vancouver to live with her mother. In Vancouver, her mental health improved. In 1983, when Mariel was 27 years old, she rented a 2-bedroom apartment in a heritage house on a block called Mole Hill. According to Mole Hill's website, it is the last surviving block of pre-First World War housing stock in Vancouver, the most significant example of Vancouver's Victorian and Edwardian era domestic architecture. The block has 30 heritage-listed properties built between 1888 and 1908, providing a direct link to the earliest days of the city of Vancouver. About 10 years after moving back to Vancouver, Mariel got a job with the Postal Service as a letter sorter. In early 1995, Mariel was diagnosed with a severe illness. She got chemotherapy and lost her hair. Mariel was a very private person, and she did not tell anyone at work that she was ill. She would go to her chemotherapy appointments alone. To hide her hair loss from her coworkers, she would wear a backward baseball cap. After a year of treatment, she beat the disease and had a clean bill of health. In late 1995, around the time that her health was improving, Mariel told several coworkers that she thought she was being stalked. It started when one of her 2 cats disappeared. Mariel hung out flyers around the neighborhood looking for information about the cat, and it included her phone number, but not her address. Then one day she found a note that had been slipped under the door of her apartment. It said she owed money for some vet bills. Muriel told her brother that she thought that someone had stolen her cat. The cat was never found. Muriel was so disturbed by the incident that she made a report with the police. Muriel then began to receive strange, anonymous letters. Then other strange things happened. Someone signed her up for a 6-month subscription to the Vancouver Sun. Then 2 magazine subscriptions were taken out in her name. Also, someone made a $120 donation in her name to the United Way. All these were paid for using Muriel's credit card. Once again, Muriel made a police report. One day, Muriel's father, Eric, was visiting her and something strange happened. They were walking back to her apartment from Stanley Park. Suddenly, Muriel started running. Eric saw an older, gray-haired man running after Muriel, calling her name. Eric asked Muriel about the incident, and she convinced him it was nothing. Sometime later, Muriel wrote to Eric and she complained about her landlord and 2 men who ate dinner with her on Sunday nights. Both men lived in apartments in the house. One man, only identified as Juan, was from Mexico. The other man, only identified as Jerry, lived in the apartment above Muriel. Muriel thought that the men somehow got a hold of the key to her apartment and they made a copy of it. She thought that they stole a pair of her jeans. One night, the door to her apartment opened at 3 a.m. She looked out the door and saw Juan walking down the stairs. She said she would get a new lock put in and she would not give a copy of the key to the landlord. Muriel continued to get anonymous letters, and they got to be so bad that she had her mail forwarded to her mother. Muriel also decided it was time to move. In early 1996, she found a nice apartment and she was set to move at the end of February 1996. In the last week of January 1996, Muriel's mother, Marjorie, received a disturbing letter addressed to Muriel. It reads, "Hi Scum, you are now 40. We hope and pray you start acting like an adult and not like a teenager. We hope you stop smoking. You stink." Marjorie didn't want to tell Muriel about the letter because she thought it would upset her. She discussed the letter with her ex-husband, Eric, and he agreed it was best not to tell Muriel about the letter. On February 16, 1996, Muriel worked a regular afternoon shift at the mail sorting facility. Then she and a co-worker walked through downtown to the West End, where they both lived. They parted ways at a hospital that was 2 blocks from Muriel's apartment. This is where they commonly split up. The next day, Marjorie became concerned when Muriel didn't call her. Muriel called her every day. Marjorie and a friend decided to go check on Muriel. The landlord unlocked the door to her apartment. Marjorie had to push hard against the door because something was blocking it. It turned out to be the body of her 40-year-old daughter. Muriel had been bludgeoned to death. She had been struck several times on the head and in the larynx. If a weapon was used, the police do not know what that weapon was, or if they do know, they have never made that information public. The police believe that Muriel was killed shortly after returning home from work. She was wearing the same clothes she was wearing when she left work. The police thought that the killer may have been waiting inside the apartment for her. The police interviewed the neighbors, and no one heard anything unusual. The police went back to the apartment a few days after the body was found to do some more investigating. A detective heard a strange sound coming from behind the refrigerator. It turned out to be Muriel's cat, not the one who went missing months earlier. The police do not believe that the cat could have gone behind the fridge by itself, so they think that the killer put it there. Not long after the murder, Juan returned to Mexico. According to Eve Lazarus' podcast, Cold Case Canada, Mariel's father, Eric, believes that Juan killed his daughter. Eric said that Mariel told her that Juan had threatened to kill her. Also, Juan and Jerry harassed her in different ways. He wanted to report the threats to the police, but Mariel convinced him not to. Eric said that since Juan lived in the building, he probably knew Mariel's routine. On the night of the murder, Jerry was having a party. So Juan knew he could attack Mariel that night, and the sounds of the murder would have been drowned out. Also, apparently, before Juan moved out, he made sure he wiped down his apartment and left no fingerprints behind. Eric believes that his daughter learned something about Juan that he didn't want her to know. Juan didn't want her to move away because he might not have been able to keep her quiet, so he decided to kill her. The police said they have investigated all angles regarding Mariel's murder. They believe that the stalking is connected to the murder. They have said that Juan is a suspect, but they are investigating other angles. However, the police have never made much progress in the case. It's been 26 years since Marilyn Lindsay was murdered, and no one has ever been arrested in the case. Her friends and family are still hoping that the killer will be brought to justice. Number 1. Sharon Lee Gallegos. In the summer of 1960, 4-year-old Sharon Lee Gallegos and her family lived in Alamogordo, New Mexico. Sharon had a brother and a sister. Their 30-year-old mother, Lupe, was raising all three of them by herself. She supported the family by working at a local motel. At 2:55 p.m. on July 21, 1960, 4-year-old Sharon and her brother Johnny were playing in an alley behind their home. As they played, a woman came up to them and offered to buy Sharon candy and clothes if she got into her car. Sharon said no, but the woman grabbed her and dragged her into the car. Lupe's sister, Beatrice, was in the kitchen and she heard the commotion. She looked out the window and saw the car driving away. Beatrice grabbed the car keys and wanted to give chase, but she remembered that she didn't know how to drive. Instead, she ran outside and flagged down a car. She asked the driver to follow the car, but when she went to point out the car, it had vanished. The police were called and roadblocks were set up, but the car wasn't found. Several people described the car as a dirty old green car. Beatrice thought it was possibly a 1951 or 52 Dodge. The woman was described as blonde, heavyset, and she was wearing glasses. The car was driven by a white man described as tall, thin, with blonde or light hair that was combed back. His most notable feature was a long, sharp nose. It turned out that people had seen the same woman in the neighborhood stalking Sharon and her family for at least a week. About a week before the kidnapping, the woman talked to a neighbor of the Gallegos. She pointed out the family's home and asked if Lupe lived there. She wanted to know if Lupe had a little girl. She then asked if Lupe had a lot of children. She also asked if anyone else lived in the house or if it was just Lupe and her children. The neighbor noticed that the woman had 2 kids in her car. One was a girl and the other was a boy with freckles. Over the next week, several people saw the green car in the neighborhood. On the day of the kidnapping, 2 family friends were at the Gallegos home, 16-year-old Mary Lou Badial and 11-year-old Dolores Badial. They noticed the green car parked outside and saw the woman watching the house. Normally, Sharon liked to go to the nearby grocery store on her own. But on that day, when Lupe asked Sharon to go buy some catsup, she didn't want to go by herself. So 11-year-old Dolores went with her. When they got close to the green car, Sharon became afraid and would not go by it without being picked up and carried. So Dolores picked her up and carried her past the car. In the hours and the days after the kidnapping, no clues were found as to what happened to 4-year-old Sharon. The FBI was called in, but despite their help, not much progress was made on the case. The police initially thought that Sharon's father may have been involved in the kidnapping. He had abandoned Lupe before Sharon was born and never shown any interest in Sharon. So he was quickly ruled out as a suspect. On July 31st, 1960, 9 days after the kidnapping, the body of a young girl was found partially buried in a creek bed near Congress, Arizona. Congress is about 540 miles from Alamogordo. Initially, it was believed that it was Sharon's body, but experts determined that it was not Sharon's body. They believed that the girl who was found was older than Sharon. Also, the girl's footprints didn't match Sharon's footprints. Sadly, the young girl found near Congress has never been identified. She has the depressing title of Little Miss Nobody. Due to the state of decomposition, a cause of death has never been determined, but it's believed she was murdered. It's believed that she was between the ages of 5 and 7. She had brown hair that was possibly tinted or dyed auburn. She was 3'6" to 4'5" and weighed somewhere between 50 and 60 pounds. She had a full set of children's teeth that were in excellent condition. On January 12, 1961, 6-year-old Rosemary Riddle was kidnapped from a migrant work camp in Kern County, California, by a pregnant woman. She was lured into a car that a man was driving. Someone who saw Rose get into the car recognized the driver. He was 30-year-old Richard Arlen Lindsay, who sometimes lived at the camp. So the police were on the lookout for Richard and his car. It was located on January 15, 1961, 3 days after the kidnapping. Sleeping inside the car was 30-year-old Richard Lindsay and his 26-year-old wife, Dixie Lindsay. Dixie was 7 months pregnant. Inside the car, the police found dried blood. The police took Richard and Dixie into custody, and they both confessed to murdering Rose. They were driving around on the afternoon of January 12th, and Richard said he wanted a young girl for sexual purposes. So they went to the labor camp, and they lured Rose into the car. Richard raped and choked her in the backseat of the car, and they thought she was dead. They dumped her on the side of the road. But then Dixie noticed she was still alive. So she got the tire iron out of the car and beat her in the head. Dixie led the police to the body of Rose. Richard and Dixie were both charged with murder. The police thought that Richard and Dixie may have been the couple who kidnapped Sharon. There were similarities between the crimes, specifically, a couple kidnapped a young girl. Also, Richard and Dixie had several physical features that were similar to the kidnappers. Dixie was described as a short, heavy-set woman, and Richard had a long, sharp nose. Richard also had hair that was combed back. The couple was initially from Texas, but traveled around the Southwest because Richard was a migrant worker. The couple also had 3 other children. The police showed photos of the couple to Sharon's aunt, Beatrice, and her brother, Johnny. But neither of them could confirm if they were the couple who kidnapped Sharon. The authorities could not find any evidence that connected the couple to Sharon's kidnapping, or find any evidence that even proved they were in the state when she was snatched. Richard pleaded guilty to the murder of Rosemary Riddle a few days after he was arrested. He was sentenced to death. He was executed via the gas chamber 11 months later on November 14, 1961. Dixie originally pleaded not guilty. She gave birth to her 4th child while awaiting trial. She went to trial in May 1961. Mid-trial, she changed her plea to guilty, and she was sentenced to life in prison. It's unclear what happened to Dixie after she was sentenced to life in prison. She is no longer registered in the California inmate database, so she was either released or she died in prison. If she is alive today, she will be 84 years old. Tragically, Sharon Lee Gallegos has never been found dead or alive. If she is still alive at the time of this video, she will be 66 years old. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Don't forget to check out our new channel, Paranormally Listed. There's a link on the screen now.